And so now we enter into the afternoon. We're going to have Jonathan Lips from Sauce Labs come, and he's going to speak about Appium and automation for mobile apps. An interesting fact about Jonathan, he actually has a degree in philosophy. So he's actually pondering why all of you are here. And he also said he wrote automated tests before he even knew what a unit test was. So maybe you could ask him about that later. And so with that, I'm going to hand it off to Jonathan. So thank you.
Thanks a lot. It's really fun to be here with you guys, and I've learned a lot as well. So I'm here to talk about Appium. It's a pretty broad and vague title, and I think you'll see why that's the case in a little bit. I work for Sauce Labs, and many of you are probably familiar with Sauce. And at Sauce, we care a lot about the maturity of the automation ecosystem in general, and we've been paying a lot of attention to mobile automation, and really wanted to be a part of this kind of new phase of mobile development where automation is finally starting to have its day. So I've had the opportunity to work pretty much full-time on this open source project called Appium during my day at Sauce for most of this year, and together with a community of people who don't work at Sauce. And I'm really excited to show you guys what we've been up to. Mobile is taking over the world, or so I keep hearing people say. And I guess it's true. The statistics show it to be true. But if it's taking over the world, where is all of our awesome test tool stuff? Where is really awesome mobile automation frameworks? Where is painless mobile CI that doesn't require a PhD to figure out how to get your certificates onto your app and your app onto your device? Yeah, it's just the beginning of making these tools really available, and I think that Appium is going to be a part of that. One thing that we haven't touched on as much at this conference is the multi-platform nature of the mobile revolution. If you want your mobile app to be used by many, many people, you probably have to have an iPhone version and an Android version, at least. And there are new entrants to the mobile OS world all the time. Of course, these different versions mean that it's complex for development and complex for testing. As you know, Android and iOS are very different user experiences, very different user interfaces. And most importantly for us, they have different SDKs. So you actually have to write your apps in Java for Android and Objective-C for iOS. That's a real big pain, of course. You could write a hybrid app, which is a thin native wrapper around a web view, and your app is basically a web application. And that's a pretty successful approach to this challenge. But as certain large companies have publicly admitted, the performance of hybrid apps is not always what we would want it to be, not always what users expect. And so for the time being, at least, we're stuck with these two large platforms that we want to support with our native apps. And that means that we want to support with our QA and with our testing, with our automation. So I want to try and tell you guys why I think that Appium is a cross-platform solution for this problem. Notice the slide says native and hybrid. So Appium cares deeply about native automation. It aims to be a great testing framework for iOS native apps and Android native apps. More than that, it aims to be a cross-platform testing framework, by which I mean writing one test and having it run and pass, hopefully, on both platforms. We also care about hybrid apps. So there are some really interesting hybrid apps that kind of blur the line between mobile apps and web apps. And they need good testing in QA, and that means testing the native wrapper, however thick or thin that is, and testing the web component. And we want to be able to do that from the same test script very easily. Appium also supports pure web testing. So if you just want to test how your web app runs in mobile Safari or Chrome on Android, you can also do that on Appium. And finally, Appium aims to support both simulators, emulators, as well as real devices. So whether you want to run it in your, on your whiteboard of mobile phones that are glued there, or whether you want to run it in a nice way that we also saw in that presentation where you have a bunch of emulators running on your desktop, you can do both. So in these early days of mobile automation, I really think, and maybe it's just because I studied philosophy, but I really think that philosophy is very important and will determine the trajectory of a lot of these projects that are rising up right now, like Appium. And so in this section, I want to tell you guys a little bit about what Appium's philosophy is, why we felt it needed to exist in the first place when, of course, there were other tools. And I think you'll come to see that this philosophy is definitely a bit opinionated, and it may not be the only right way to do things, but I hope to convince you that some of these are good ideas at least. So you can think about Appium's philosophy in the form of 4 rules or principles. The first rule is that you want to test the same app that you submit to your app store. You shouldn't have to compile in third-party libraries or frameworks in order to test your app. I think we can all understand the reason for this. If you test one version of your app and you submit another version of your app to the App Store, what if this version actually has bugs? And I think we've all been bit one time or another by issues like this. So if you can submit an app binary which has actually passed tests, that instills a great sense of confidence in your code and in your application's behavior. Secondly, we live in a world where people code in all kinds of languages, increasingly multiple languages in a given day. So why should your test framework tell you which language you have to use? And why should your test framework tell you which other framework tools you can use or not use, and which APIs you can use and not use? We think that the mobile automation framework should be as agnostic and as general and inclusive as possible, so that, as I believe it was Igor said yesterday, you could have a team of competent Java developers or expert Java developers who decide that actually our test suite should be in Ruby because it just makes more sense for it to be interpreter-based and to hook in better with Jenkins or whatever it is. Just because you write your application code in Java or Objective-C doesn't mean that you should write your functional tests in the same way. I think this rule is very important. Use a standard automation specification and API. We've been through standards wars in many different testing arenas in the past, notably web testing, and I don't think there's any reason to go through that again. And as Melanie mentioned yesterday, there is a whole ecosystem of tools that already exist for these other specifications that we could, I think her word was uplift and reuse in the context of mobile automation. I think that's really important for getting people from no mobile tests to a lot of mobile tests very quickly when they're using a specification that they're already familiar with. And I'm going to talk a little more about this in a bit. Another very important aspect of building a mobile automation framework is building a great community around it. We strongly believe that this community should be open source. And it shouldn't just be open source in name, but it should be open source in spirit and in the energy and collaboration efforts that exist around the project. It seems to me that these projects are the ones that actually tend to win in terms of technology too. Just having that groundswell of user support, filing bugs on GitHub, and contributor support by submitting patches and really making the project better. I think this is what ultimately will win developers over to to using your project. And so we think this is very important and are trying to make Appium as open and as friendly and as easy to hack on for everybody as possible. And just recently, we resolved our 460th ticket on GitHub, I think. That's not all issues. That includes pull requests, of course. But to me, it's been really awesome to see a lot of people contributing and participating. So we think that's important. OK. Now, in this section, I want to talk about how Appium was accepted to be the mobile automation framework for the US space program. Actually, that's not true. I'm going to talk about how Appium exists in the space of other mobile automation frameworks. And I want to talk about how it exists in comparison with these other frameworks on the level of philosophy of the points that I just brought up, not necessarily on the level of specific features at this point. So here's a view of what's kind of out there right now. For iOS automation, you've got Calabash, Frank. You can use raw UI automation JavaScript and instruments. You can use UIS driver or KIF. And Android, again, Calabash. And you've heard of all of these, I expect. And we learned a lot about UI Automator today, so you know how that works. There's also a project called Selenium, which is based on instruments. And there's a little asterisk by that one because it's actually available from within Appium now, too. So it may or may not be a separate framework. But anyway, you can see that I'm trying to make a point with this slide in terms of where I placed Appium. None of these other frameworks really try to do cross-platform. Or if they do so in a way that doesn't keep the same API. So Appium is trying to sit right in this middle spot and say, hey, let's automate our cross-platform apps using one platform, one set of tests. Here's a little comparison chart. And again, this is not comparison based on features, but on how well I see these projects following the rules that I mentioned. And ultimately, it was this kind of perspective that led us to want to build something like Appium, because we felt that there was a spot for a project that followed these rules and would ultimately lead to a mature automation ecosystem for mobile. Now, this is my subjective take, and you guys might disagree with some of this, and I hope to hear about it over beers tonight, or during the Q&A, I suppose. Now, another word about Selenium WebDriver, and this goes back to Rule 3, which was use a standard automation specification and API. The stuff I have here on these slides repeats a lot of what we've already learned in the last couple of days. If you weren't familiar with Selenium WebDriver, you now know quite a bit about it from what other people have said. The basic point is that there are a lot of automators, testers, developers, people who write tests that are already familiar with this model of automation. So we don't think that there's any reason to go back to the drawing board and come up with an entirely new model for mobile. Of course, the model can't be exactly the same because there are some differences between the way people interact with the web and the ways that they use their mobile devices. But with a few properly situated extensions, we think that the WebDriver spec is relatively mature and a good place to start for mobile automation. Not only that, all of these tools already exist around WebDriver. You have client libraries in every language, including languages like Haskell and Go and Clojure. I don't think there's any in Pascal or maybe even C, but that'll probably change someday. It's also somewhat official. One of the chief conspirators behind this situation is here. And I think it's a great thing that there is momentum behind this one standard. You guys all know the XKCD about standards. And what we're trying to avoid is exactly what that cartoon depicts. So we want sort of standards deproliferation, if you will. So hopefully I've convinced you that using WebDriver as your automation protocol in mobile is somewhat of a good idea. now I want to talk a little bit about what Appium looks like under the hood. So what does a mobile automation framework that adheres to this philosophy actually look like? How does it work? Well, it's basically a web server that creates and handles specifically WebDriver sessions. So at this point, it's basically exactly like a Selenium server. It receives requests from client libraries, which speak JSON over HTTP, and then it handles those requests in different ways depending on the platform that you're looking at. For both iOS and Android, Appium starts a test case on the device or in the simulator that spawns a server of some kind and listens for commands from the main Appium process. So I have test case in quotes here because each of the vendors supply a way to run test cases on the emulator on the devices. And Appium sort of hijacks these and sticks something in there that can lie around forever and we can send commands to and get results from. That's kind of the hack that makes all this work. Specifically for iOS, Appium proxies these commands to a UI automation script running in the instruments context. So Apple provides this application called Instruments, and it's a graphical application that lets you do a lot of things with your apps. It lets you profile them and find memory leaks and all kinds of stuff that's irrelevant to automation. But it also has an automation component, actually a little box where you can type in JavaScript. And this JavaScript has access to an API called UI automation. And you can click a button and it'll run in the context of your application. So we sort of take this and abuse it in order to fit our needs. So let's camp on this diagram for a little bit. If you take a look at the right-hand side with the picture of the shiny iPhone, there's a little box in it which says bootstrap.js. So it turns out that you can actually launch instruments from the command line. And instead of typing your JavaScript in a box, you can provide instruments with a JavaScript file to be executed on the device once your application is loaded. So we've taken this JavaScript file and put an infinite loop inside of it. And each time you go through this loop, we call out to the command line, because this is one of the things that Apple has conveniently and inexplicably included in its UI automation framework as a way to call out to the shell and to run arbitrary shell commands. So we use this power to launch a Unix socket client. It's actually written in Node. And this client wakes up and looks for a Unix socket server that I'm calling the instruments command server, which is part of the main Appium process. And this command server can then say, oh yeah, I have a command. Here you go, and gives it to the command client. This command client writes out the command to standard out. It's picked up by bootstrap.js. And that's executed in the context of instruments, and thus in the context of your application. So how does a command lifecycle go? Starting at the left with your WebDriver script, let's say you have a command like, I don't know, click on an element. So your WebDriver script will create a HTTP request to the main Appium server. It'll send that request in the form of JSON over. And Appium will, since it already knows that we're doing iOS automation in this case, will pass it on to the instruments command server. And it'll sit there and wait until the command client on its next poll wakes up and asks for a command. We get it the command goes all the way back to bootstrap.js and is executed. The result is retrieved. The command client wakes up again, talks to the server, says, hey, I've got a result from the last command that you sent me. The command server says, great, thank you very much. By the way, here's the next command that I've been holding on to while you've been slacking off. working really slow. And it sends the result all the way back to your script, so you can evaluate whether the result is appropriate in your test. So the situation is similar with Android. And instead, we proxy commands to a UI Automator test case. So we now know everything about UI Automator. And we know that it runs in these special test cases, JUnit test cases on the device. So the picture here is a little simpler because Google has decided to give us tools that make a little more sense. You can actually run UI Automator scripts from the command line very easily. Presumably, they could be part of your CI. Of course, they have to be in Java, and that's one of the things we're trying to get away from. No offense to the UI Automator team, who's done an excellent job. So here we have, instead of Bootstrap.js, we have Bootstrap jar. And this is our UI Automator test case. It's been compiled in Java. And it gets launched on the device. And as soon as it is launched, it actually spins up a TCP server. So in this diagram, the server is on the device and the client is in the Appium process. So it's a little mirror image of what was going on with the iOS. So the lifecycle of a command here looks like your command comes from your script, again goes to the main Appium server. We know that you want Android this time, and so the command goes to a TCP client that Appium brings up, connects to the TCP server on the Android device, gives it the command, and again, the command is processed, result is passed back all the way to your test so you can evaluate how it's going. So that's what happens under the hood. That's how we can provide one kind of front-end API to these two completely different mobile automation backends. Let's see what it actually does in action. Before I run the demo, I just want to point out that I think it's really cool that Appium opens the door to true cross-platform mobile testing. In other words, one test in two mobile platforms. We've been used to this for a while with web browsers. You can write one Selenium test that runs on all the different web browsers, and so you can uncover cross-platform issues. But so far, this hasn't really been possible or easy with mobile devices. I happen to have an app that was developed for iPhone and Android with the same kind of UI and layout and everything. There's a company called Woven that has this photo aggregation app. It brings in photos from all your different media sources around the web and shows them in one place. And the Woven team has been involved in helping Appium development for a long time, and they were kind enough to give me a couple builds of their application. Let's look at some of the code that is going to be involved in the demo. So in this slide, I have a couple sets of desired capabilities. And by the way, we're in JavaScript for this demo. If you're not familiar with Selenium, desired capabilities are ways of telling the server what sort of thing you want to automate. So in this case, we have desired capabilities for iOS, and we're saying that we want the iPhone simulator device. And for Android, we want Android. And then we have to say what app we want to automate. So we can literally just pass a path to the precompiled application. For Android, we need a little bit more information. Because of the way that we start the app, we don't want to go through the whole process of clicking on the apps button, swiping screens, and finding the app. We just want to launch it immediately. So we use certain commands that require the app package and activity that you want to launch. And I have a configuration section which encapsulates the few differences that do exist between the iPhone and Android version of this app. These are Selenium selectors that, because of the difference in the equivalent of tag names, I guess, or UI element names, because of the differences that exist on these two platforms, I need different selectors. Now, this is something that could obviously be fixed with certain tag name conventions in the future, But for now, I just have these few discrepancies. So this is what my test code looks like. I'm looping through each of the configurations. So I'm going to run the tests in series, in succession. First, I'll run the Android test, then the iOS test. And for each of these configurations, I'm initializing a WebDriver session. That's what happens in the describe block here. It has custom code that I've written that launches a WebDriver session and shuts it down after each test. And the actual test logic looks like this. Or this is the beginning part of the test that you're going to see. Driver series is, again, something I wrote so that I could have all of these methods appear one after the other on different lines, rather than having a big JavaScript callback pyramid that looks really horrible on slides. So what's going on here is that we're finding an element by its name, which in the case of Android is the content description that we learned about. We're clicking on the element. We're finding the email field, typing in my email address, finding the password field, and typing in my password. And then we're sending a new line, which is the signal to the app that we want to hit the go button on the keyboard. And this is just for fun. In case JavaScript isn't your thing, here's how I would have written the last bit in Python. So you can see it's very similar. You can do this in any language that has a WebDriver library. So I was planning on doing a live demo, but I have learned from the Woven team that the builds I have are rather unstable. And indeed, I noticed that a few times when I was preparing this. And we all think it's probably a better idea to avoid embarrassment all around and not have the app or the demo crash right in the middle of it. So I have a video that I'd like to show on, oh, I think you guys have the video. So go ahead and run that. It's quite long, as you can see. It's kind of a basic smoke test of the application, exercises a lot of different aspects. So I've launched the Appium server, and now I'm running the test. The Android emulator is in front, and the iPhone Chrome is behind it, so don't get confused. Here's the flow that we saw, typing in the email address, password, clicking the sign in button. And now we're going to find a photo album and flip through some of the photos, find one and tap on it, and let the controls fade away, and do a tap to get them to come back. Navigate back up, swipe over, and we're going to try and find our account pane. The Android version of this app doesn't have a sign out button, which is what the test is looking for. So it's going to go ahead and end, and we're going to switch to the iPhone version. So this is the exact same code. You saw the loop that I had. We're just running the exact same test code inside of a loop. The iPhone tends to be pretty snappy because it's a simulator rather than a true emulator. And we're doing the same things. Now, in the iPhone version of the app, as I said, the account pane does have a sign out button. So we're going to attempt to sign out of the app. We don't really need to, since the app state is reset automatically between each of the tests. But there we go. We got the alert, handled it. And as you can see on the top, both tests pass, which, since it's a video, I would hope that they did. So that's the demo. I think it's pretty cool that you can actually have the same test running on 2 mobile devices. A word about how you can actually kind of get started with Appium if you're interested. You can run it from the command line, as I was doing. You can get it from npm. if you like Node. Or you can actually download appium.app, which is a project to wrap Appium in a graphical user interface by Dan Cuellar. And it's really awesome. So you can configure the server, tell it which app you want to automate, do all these things from a nice graphical interface, and you still have the same log output for debugging. But the coolest thing is the Appium inspector. So this is a part of appium.app. Once you've got your app launched, you can click the inspector button, and this window pops up. And it gives you a view of the hierarchy of the application, a little bit like the UI Automator viewer that we just learned about, which is the tool that I've been using for my Android test writing. But this inspector works great on iOS and will soon work as well on Android. Lets you introspect the app, get element names and features so that you can find elements and interact with them from your tests. It even has a simple record and playback tool. So you can hit record and then perform a few actions and hit stop, and then you can play those actions back at a later time. So it's the equivalent of Selenium IDE for Appium, for mobile automation. And I think this is pretty awesome. Here's an example of how you could set up your desktop if you're using this with your iPad simulator on the right and your inspector and the Appium server and so on. So I just demonstrated Appium in a local context, but there are some limitations if I wanted to scale up this kind of test running to use in a build or to use in my continuous integration. One of the obvious limitations is that you can only have one iPhone device or simulator running in instruments for every copy of Mac OS that you have. So it's a technical limitation that we haven't yet figured a way around, that anytime you want to run an iOS test on Appium, it's going to take a whole Mac computer. So it'd be a very expensive proposition to get an entire closet full of Mac minis or whatever to run a bunch of these tests in serial or in parallel. Android isn't quite as limited. You can have multiple devices connected. You can talk to each of them. But either way, there are some computational and other limitations. So the company I work for, Sauce Labs, has been hard at work putting Appium in the cloud so that if you don't want to install Appium, if you don't want to get all your emulators and simulators and SDKs and devices set up and Xcode to the perfect version, you can just run it on Sauce instead. And you can do it in parallel, which will greatly reduce the time that your build takes. So if you're interested, we're releasing this for general consumption very, very soon. You can check out that URL. I'm not going to take questions quite yet. Actually have a surprise demo, which I will try and do live. I was really inspired by the Firefox OS talk yesterday. I thought it was really cool that a team would build automation in from the very ground level of working on the operating system. And given that they also chose Selenium WebDriver as the protocol of choice, I got Malini yesterday and asked her to share with me some of the details of how they implemented that. And I've actually got Firefox OS support working in Appium. And I want to show you guys an example of that. So let's switch to the computer, please. So here's their little simulator that I got. And this is the test script that I'm going to be running. So I decided to write it in CoffeeScript just for kicks. Basically, our device is now Firefox OS, and the app that we want to automate is the Contacts app that comes with the device. First thing we do with the test is get our URL, check whether it's the right app that's loaded, check that my name isn't anywhere in the app currently, because the point of this test is to add myself as a contact. We click the add button, type in my details, hit save, assert that the name appears correctly, and we click the edit pane as well. So let's try and run this. So here's Appium launched, and trying to run the coffee script. So contacts launched. Okay. And everything was verified. So nice. Yeah, and I think at least 80% of that applause should go to the Firefox OS team for doing something so awesome. Anyway, I just thought it was a really cool kind of proof of concept of how when you have the right protocol and the right tools, you can make things happen really quickly. So that's it. Ready for questions?
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Jonathan. Hello. Are we on? I was just waiting one second. Oh, there we go. Thank you. Yeah, I was saying thank you, Jonathan. That was awesome, and thank you for striving so hard to put that out into open source and giving everybody else the ability to do this cross-platform. There were a lot of questions I got earlier, and I knew your talk was coming up, and so it's great to see all these different devices sort of having a place to get this automation. One thing I took away is machines are a lot faster at typing on these phones than we are.
It's beautiful to watch.
I'm sure you guys got something else, but that's what I got. Okay, with that, all just aside, we'll go to some of the questions here. So first one up, please. Your name, where you're from, and your question, please.
Hi, I'm Basil. I'm a test engineer at Google Mobile Search. So it was a neat trick to reuse a WebDriver protocol to enable testing native applications. But can you also test web view applications with Appium?
Yes, you can. I did not demonstrate that, but basically what happens is so let's say for iOS, you load an app that has a web view in it. You call the WebDriver window handles command, and it gives you a list of IDs, usually one, because there's usually just one web view open. And then you can set that to be your window, and Appium takes that to be a signal that you actually want to automate that web view from now on. And so at that point, you're just writing a regular web Selenium test. So all the commands that happen are executed in the context of that web view. And then there's a special command that lets you sort of escape back out of that and automate your native layer again.
So it's possible to automate applications that take you to web view and back to native?
So that's a different question. I haven't found any way on iOS. On Android, the answer is yes, because UI Automator lets you control the entire device, which is brilliant. On iOS, as soon as your app switches, your test is over because the instrument's context only exists in that app. So there may be a way around this, but right now it appears like a technical limitation.
Thank you.
Yeah, great, thank you. We have another question up over here on the right, please.
Hi, Steve again from Google. So maybe I just didn't understand. I'm used to doing browser automation, writing XPaths. You said that this will also work on native applications, but that you only need write one test across platforms. How do I express element locators if I know that the implementation may be a native app or may be a browser?
So I may not totally understand your question. Are you asking, what if I have a web app and a native app? Can I test them both with the same script?
Yeah, I'm trying to. Did you make that claim that you can?
I made the claim that you can test a native Android app and a native iPhone app with the same script, because the structure is probably very similar. I suppose if you had a web app whose structure was identical in terms of the hierarchy, because you can use an XPath sort of bastardized XPath syntax to traverse the hierarchy. So if it's general enough, I suppose that would work. I haven't tried that, but you can. The one thing that would work across all native platforms and web is get element by name. So that's kind of what we chose as the equivalent of ID in native land, because Android has content description, iOS has name, which is their accessibility label. but neither of these things are enforced to be unique, so we didn't want to use ID. But you can also use getElementByName in HTML, obviously. So if the name matched on all these 3 platforms, you would reliably find the element on all platforms.
Okay.
Yes, thank you. And one more question over here, please.
So Kevin Jin with Google. So I have a question about how is it different from native driver?
So native driver is an unfortunately abandoned project, which since when we started working on Appium, we knew it was sort of abandoned, didn't get a whole lot of attention. But this could be thought of as sort of the spiritual successor to native driver.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And so I'll take a question from the moderator up here. It says, for Android, does Appium support OSs earlier than Jelly Bean?
Yes, recently it does. So you heard that UI Automator, which is the default mobile automation backend for Android, is only supported API levels 16 and up. However, there is a separate project by a guy named Dominic Derry called Selendroid, and it uses instrumentation, which is available on much earlier API levels. And so what we've done is enabled Selendroid as sort of an Appium add-on, so that if you run the Selendroid configuration, you just ask for a Selendroid as a device, and you'll be using that backend instead of UI Automator. So that's how we can get WebView support on Android, because as we heard, UI Automator doesn't really support WebViews either.
Great. Thank you. We have time for one more question, and you are up first. Please.
Hi, this is Dipali again from the New York Times. My first question is, how do you validate your test results? And the following question is, how the script handle the crashes. For example, if you open the app from the widget on Android, how the script handle the crashes thing.
And no pressure, you get 45 seconds.
Okay, so in reverse order, scripts handle crashes by ending the session. So usually it knows when something has crashed, and it just ends the session. You get an error in your code that you're probably not expecting, and the server is waiting for new commands. How you validate your code is the same way that you would with a regular Selenium script for the web. You can introspect, or I should say interrogate, different parts of your application. So if like what I did with Firefox OS, I asked for the text that was in a certain place and checked to make sure that it was equal to my name. And so that's where the assertions come in my test.
So what about the images that display on the device?
And for that follow-up, I invite you both to talk as much as you like out there.
Sure.
Great.
With that, thank you,
Yeah.
Jonathan. Thank
Cheers.
you.
Yeah. Thank you.